Alright everybody, we're going to start this seminar. It is called Introduction to the Open Systems Interconnect Model, or OSI model. The actual formal standard is called the Open Systems Interconnect Reference Model. The key is what we are going to be describing to you in the next 4 sections is a theoretical dividing of communication systems and how they talk to each other, or how two computers talk to each other, and how we divide the programs that.
This section is HTTP session initiation. Basically, it's going to describe HTTP and how it initiates a session between a client and the server. Later on, we'll talk about TCP and IP and Ethernet, how they support this HTTP session. But right now, we just want to talk about how HTTP, being part of a browser, establishes a session between the client and the server, or initiates a session between the client and the server. This picture is sort of a duplicate of the one in the previous section, where you have HTTP in the client and HTTP in the server, and it shows that sending data between the client and the server, it goes through routers A, B, and C. The key to this is that HTTP, in order to communicate and have a session between the client and the server, needs TCP, IP, and Ethernet to support that session. So HTTP information is routed between the client and the server. This shows one of those routes. This picture is only here to show you that inside the client, a browser uses HTTP to initiate the session. The client must send data from the client to the server across that IP architecture on the lower part, but the key is that HTTP, being a browser, initiates a session with the server. The next slide shows you the actual web page that would fit inside this browser when it's downloaded to the client. This server will download its web page to the client, and it'll fit inside the browser. Then the client can initiate application sessions between the client and the server just by clicking on one of those icons in that browser. Every time you click on one of those icons inside that browser, it will establish a separate session for whatever that application is. If an application in the client communicates with an application in the server, here HTTP is the example of the application, then the communication at the application layer, is what people say, is just end-to-end between the client and the server memory, and TCP/IP, the architecture that shows on the lower hand of this slide, actually supports communication between HTTP in the client and HTTP in the server. This picture really gives you an idea of some of the key terminology in communication via HTTP in the client and the server. First of all, a browser inside the client, when clicked on, will initiate the HTTP session. Normally, the session is at what is called a socket. So the socket in the client would be basically the IP address of the client and the port number of the client related to the browser application, probably HTTP. Obviously, over in the server, the communication, downloading the web page into the client browser, would be at the server socket. The server socket would be basically the server's IP address and HTTP port number 80 inside the server. Notice again, TCP, IP, and at the physical and data link layer, it would be Ethernet. So inside of that cloud is the router architecture that we have shown you on the previous slides. When a client wants to initiate an HTTP session, it initiates the session by sending a request. This picture here is an example of the data that's inside the HTTP header when it requests a session with the server. And the objective is just to let you know that there is more than one thing that goes inside of that HTTP header in order to request the server initiate a session. The key is that HTTP has information that describes what inside the server should be done with this header in order to establish the session. The server will respond with its own information in an HTTP header. Now this information is a little bit different. It tells more about the server. It tells more about the content that the server is going to send, because basically when HTTP and the client establishes a session with the server, it's going to download the server's web page to the client so that the client can put it inside the browser.